There's a funny thing about comfort. It's like a well-worn armchair in a quiet corner. Feels good, familiar. Safe, even. You sink into it day after day, year after year, and before you know it, the cushions have molded to your exact shape, the springs grown with your weight. You tell yourself you like it there, that you prefer it, that you've earned the right to settle. You tell yourself that anything outside that armchair, anything that might make you shift, stretch, or God forbid, stand up is just trouble, unnecessary trouble. And for a long time you believe it. You mistake the absence of immediate pain for the profound presence of peace. You mistake being stuck for being steady. But life, she's a tricky mistress. She's got a way of kicking that armchair out from under you, whether you like it or not. And often it takes that fall to remember you had legs all along. Sometimes it takes hitting the cold, hard floor to realize the chair was holding you. The chair was holding you hostage all along. Hank didn't think much about armchairs or hostages. Not at 5 a.m. anyway. His world started with the relentless, digital bleat of an alarm clock that felt less like a gentle wake-up call and more like a drill sergeant barking orders. Every weekday for 30 years, the same sound, the same reluctant stretch, the same heavy swing of his legs over the side of the bed. 48 years old, and the worn linoleum floor still felt like an ice bath to his feet each morning. He was a factory man, plain and simple. 6 days a week, sometimes 7 if overtime was offered, he drove his beat-up pickup a dozen miles to the old Phoenix plant, the smell of grease and hot metal already clinging to his clothes before he even punched in. His hands were a roadmap of his life, calloused, scarred, the knuckles thick and gnarled from years of wrestling with stubborn machinery. His back, a constant throb, was another silent ledger of every heavy lift, every awkward twist. He looked like he was carved from something solid, dependable. But in his tired eyes, if you looked close enough, there was a quiet weariness that no amount of sleep could ever quite chase away. A man who kept his complaints to himself, mostly, because what was the point? Complaining didn't change the hum of the press, or the clang of the forklift, or the steady march of time. The plant was a symphony of industrial noise, a giant beast that swallowed men whole and spit them out 9 hours later, smelling of oil and sweat. Hank was on the line, assembling widgets, thousands of them, day in and day out. Each movement precise, honed by decades of repetition. Pick up part A, slot into part B, secure with 3 screws, tighten. Repeat. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost meditative if you let it be. It was predictable. Safe. A man knew what was expected of him. He knew he could do it. And in that there was a strange, grim comfort. But comfort didn't pay the bills. Not all of them, anyway. Not anymore. The mortgage on their small, well-maintained but dated bungalow in the older part of town was always a monster at the end of the month. Then there was the car insurance, the rising cost of groceries, Michael's community college tuition, Emily's braces. Sarah, his wife, worked part-time at the hardware store, stretching every dollar until it screamed. They made it work just barely. Every month was a delicate balancing act, a high-wire walk over a pit of red numbers. One wrong step, one unexpected expense, and the whole thing could come tumbling down. He kept a quiet ledger in his head, mentally ticking off what was due, what was left over. There was never enough left over. Inside, where no one else saw, was a different kind of balance sheet, one measured in dreams instead of dollars. Hank remembered a younger version of himself, a boy who'd sketched designs for impossible contraptions in the margins of his school books, a young man who'd seen himself building something, inventing something, anything but slotting part A into part B for the rest of his life. He remembered the fire, the restless energy. But life had a way of smothering those sparks, didn't it? One by one, he'd let them die out, telling himself it was being realistic, telling himself it was for the family. The real truth, the bitter pill he swallowed in the dead of night, was that he was terrified. Terrified of failing, yes, but even more terrified of trying and failing. Terrified of the unknown. The thought of stepping outside the predictable rhythm of the factory, the well-worn grooves of his life, felt like staring into an abyss. Change was discomfort. Discomfort was pain, and Hank, above all else, was a master of avoiding pain. He'd learned to lower his expectations, to shrink his world, to make peace with the dull ache of just getting by rather than risk the sharper, more immediate sting of struggle or uncertainty. He had convinced himself that staying put, even if it was unfulfilling, was the same as being steadfast. That avoiding trouble was the same as seeking peace. It was a prison of his own making, built brick by brick with every rationalization, every quiet retreat from opportunity, every time he chose the path of least resistance. He watched his kids growing up, Michael talking about computers, Emily dreaming of art school, and a quiet, desperate longing would stir within him. A longing for them to have more, to be more than he had allowed himself to be. And a silent, aching fear that he was trapping them in the same small world he'd built for himself. But even the sturdiest walls can crumble when the earth beneath them shifts. For Hank, the earthquake came not with a tremor, but with the crisp, official flutter of an envelope landing on his porch one Tuesday afternoon. He'd just gotten home, the grime of the factory still clinging to his skin, the drone of the machines still echoing in his ears. He picked up the stack of mail, flyers, a utility bill, another catalog from Sarah, and then nestled in the middle a thick, plain white envelope with the hospital's logo. It had a weight to it, a substantial feel that made his stomach clench before he even tore it open. His hands, calloused and smudged, fumbled a little as he pulled out the folded sheet. It wasn't a reminder, it was an itemized statement. Sarah had been in a few months back for those dizzy spells, remember. Nothing serious, the doctor said. Just some tests, some observation. He'd figured insurance would cover most of it. Always did, always had to. He unfolded the paper slowly, his eyes scanning for the total, the number that always made him squint. His breath caught in his throat. He saw it, plain as day, bold and unforgiving. It wasn't just a few hundred. It wasn't even a couple thousand. It was 10 with a comma followed by 3 zeros, $10,000. His vision blurred for a second, then sharpened with a cold, metallic taste in his mouth. 10,000. That was almost 6 months of his take-home pay if they were lucky enough to save every single dime, which they weren't. That was more than the down payment he'd scraped together for their bungalow all those years ago. That was everything they had in their emergency fund, and then some. Way, way more than some. He read it again, thinking maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him, hoping a digit would magically disappear. But it remained a stark, brutal truth. He walked into the kitchen where Sarah was stirring a pot of chili, the comforting scent doing nothing to calm his rising panic. He didn't speak, just laid the bill on the worn Formica counter between them, pushing it gently towards her. She glanced up, her smile fading as she saw the paper, then his face. Her brow furrowed, a silent question in her eyes. "Sarah," he managed, his voice a gravelly whisper. "The hospital bill." She picked it up, her fingers tracing the numbers, her face going pale. The spoon clattered softly against the ceramic pot as she set it down. Her eyes met his, wide and filled with a fear he recognized instantly. It was the same fear that had just seized him by the throat. It was the fear of the fall. The silence in the kitchen stretched, heavy and suffocating, interrupted only by the gentle simmer of the chili. In that moment, the carefully constructed illusion of just getting by shattered. They weren't just getting by, they were teetering on the edge of a cliff, and his avoidance, his constant retreat from anything that felt like a challenge, had left them with no safety net at all. He saw it then, clear as day. His fear of discomfort hadn't protected them. It had made them vulnerable. It had made them weak. He couldn't sleep. The house was a tomb, the only sounds the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall and the distant hum of the refrigerator. It was 3 a.m. He'd been lying there for hours, staring at the ceiling, the numbers on that bill flashing behind his eyelids like a neon sign of his own failure. Finally, he gave up, swinging his legs out of bed, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He didn't bother with the lights. Moonlight sliced through the living room window, casting long, distorted shadows of his furniture, making the familiar feel alien, menacing. He sank onto the worn sofa, the springs creaking in protest, mirroring the ache in his own bones. His head fell into his hands. It wasn't just the $10,000. That was just the spark. What truly burned him was the realization of how he'd let it come to this. How he'd let himself come to this. He thought back to every time he'd said no to a chance for a little extra training at the plant, to a night class at the community college that might have opened doors. Every time he'd shrugged off a side gig that required a little more hustle, a little more sweat than he was comfortable giving. Too much trouble, he'd always told himself. Not worth the headache. Better to stick to what I know. He'd called it being practical, being realistic. But lying there in the cold, unforgiving silence of the pre-dawn, he knew what it really was. It was cowardice, plain and simple. He'd been so afraid of tripping he'd refused to walk. So afraid of a scratch he'd wrapped himself in cotton wool. And what had it gotten him? A life built on sand, ready to collapse at the slightest push. His family, the very reason he'd told himself he played it safe, was now exposed, unprotected, because he hadn't had the guts to step outside his comfort zone. The faces of Michael and Emily, sound asleep in their beds, flashed in his mind. Michael, who was saving every penny to build his own computer, dreaming of code and algorithms. Emily, sketching late into the night, her canvases filled with vibrant worlds Hank barely understood. He'd wanted them to have better, to reach higher. But what example had he set? He'd shown them how to stay small, how to avoid risk, how to settle for the dull safety of the familiar even when it was slowly suffocating their dreams and his own. A knot formed in his stomach, tighter than any physical pain he'd endured at the factory. It was shame. A deep, corrosive shame that ate at his insides. He'd always prided himself on being dependable, on providing. But what kind of provider was he if a single unforeseen bill could bring their whole world to its knees? He thought about his father, a man who'd seen harder times, who'd never backed down from a challenge. He'd always met adversity head-on, even if it meant getting knocked down a few times. Hank, though, he'd seen adversity coming, and he'd built a detour around it every single time. Now the road was gone. There was nowhere left to go but straight through it, and he had no idea how. The fear of failure had kept him from trying. The fear of discomfort had kept him stuck. And now, the very thing he'd tried so desperately to avoid, pain, struggle, uncertainty, was staring him down, bigger and more terrifying than he had ever imagined. His life, his family's future, hung precariously in the balance, a direct consequence of his lifelong refusal to lean into the burn. The silence of the house pressed in, amplifying the frantic rhythm of his own heart. The glow of the digital clock on his nightstand shifted from 3:17 to 3:18. A minute. Just 1 minute. And in that minute, everything Hank thought he knew about himself, about life, about survival, had shattered into a million pieces. He'd spent his life running from the edge, carefully navigating the middle ground, thinking he was clever, thinking he was safe. But the middle ground had just led him to a deeper, wider chasm, and now he was hanging by a thread over it, looking down. Sarah's breathing was soft and even beside him, a stark contrast to the earthquake rumbling inside his chest. He closed his eyes, squeezing them tight as if he could wring the fear out of himself. It didn't work. The fear was a living thing, squirming and biting. But beneath the fear, beneath the shame, a different kind of feeling started to simmer. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like a deep, guttural refusal. A quiet, resolute no. No more backing down, no more detours, no more settling for good enough when good enough meant barely treading water. He looked at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, the familiar patterns from the street light filtering through the blinds. They'd always been comforting. Now they felt like prison bars. Enough. He whispered, the sound barely audible even to himself, a dry rasp in the dark. It wasn't a roar of defiance, just a weary, absolute knowing. Enough of this half-life. Enough of letting fear dictate every turn, every choice. He didn't know what enough meant he was supposed to do, not yet. He just knew what he couldn't do anymore. Stay the same. He couldn't go back to the man who'd seen trouble and politely stepped aside, hoping it would pass. The trouble had finally caught up, and it was demanding a fight. The next morning, the alarm blared at 5 a.m., just like every other morning for the last 25 years. Hank lay there for a second longer than usual, the familiar urge to just pull the covers over his head and disappear almost overwhelming. The weight of the previous night's realizations was a physical burden on his chest. It felt easier to just sink back into the familiar, to pretend the world hadn't changed, even if it was a lie. Then he remembered the whisper in the dark. Enough. He swung his legs out of bed, the cold floor hitting his bare feet like a jolt. This was it. Day one, but day one of what? He didn't have a grand plan. No self-help book had magically appeared under his pillow. All he had was that quiet decision, that refusal to retreat. As he stood in front of the mirror, shaving, he looked at his own reflection. Not just seeing the tired lines, the stubble, but truly looking. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't just see a man going through the motions. He saw the potential for a fighter. His gaze fell on the old, rickety workbench in the garage, piled high with tools, some rusty, some broken, all of it a monument to deferred projects and forgotten intentions. For months, Sarah had been asking him to fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen, a minor annoyance that had turned into a steady drip, 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 a constant reminder of something he could easily fix but always found an excuse to put off. Too tired after work, he'd say. Got other things to do. But the truth was, it was just one more thing that required a little effort, a little discomfort, and he'd unconsciously avoided it. Today, that changed. Instead of grabbing his lunch pail and heading straight for the factory, Hank walked into the garage. The air was cool and smelled of oil and dust. He stared at the faucet repair kit he'd bought months ago, still in its original packaging, mocking him. His stomach clenched. It was early, he was tired, and he had a full shift ahead. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to leave it, to just get to work, to stick to the routine. The comfort of the familiar path was a strong current, pulling him back. But he thought of Sarah's worried face, of Michael's quiet frustration, of Emily's dreams. He thought of that medical bill looming. And then he remembered what he'd told himself just hours before: pain's just fuel if you learn how to burn it. This little drip was a tiny piece of that pain, a small challenge, and he was going to burn it. He ripped open the packaging. The instructions looked like hieroglyphics. He picked up the wrench, feeling clumsy, already anticipating the frustration, the scraped knuckles, the inevitable setback. He almost put it down. His hand hovered over the tool, muscles tense. It would be so easy to just leave it, so easy to say, later. But then a stubbornness he hadn't felt in years welled up. A tiny spark. He grabbed the wrench a little tighter this time. No, he muttered under his breath. Not later. Now. He watched a YouTube video on his phone, balancing it precariously on a shelf, his brow furrowed in concentration. The process looked simple, but his hands, usually so adept at the repetitive tasks of the factory, felt awkward and unfamiliar with the nuances of plumbing. He turned off the water, unscrewed the old faucet, battling with a corroded nut that seemed to be welded in place. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He cursed under his breath, wanting to give up, wanting to throw the wrench across the garage. This was stupid. This was hard. This was exactly what he usually avoided. But he kept going. He tightened, he loosened, he scraped his knuckles exactly as he'd predicted. He felt that familiar surge of frustration, that knot in his stomach that usually signaled his retreat. But this time he didn't retreat. He pushed through it. He leaned into the discomfort, feeling the burn of it, and for the first time not as a sign to stop, but as an indicator that he was doing something different, something hard. Finally, with a grunt of effort, the new faucet was installed. He turned the water back on, holding his breath. No leak, not a single drip. A small victory, yes, but to Hank it felt like he'd climbed Everest. He wiped his hands on a greasy rag, a faint smile touching his lips. It was 6:30 a.m. He was already late for his usual leaving time. His back ached, his knuckles stung, and he felt a strange, unfamiliar exhaustion, but it wasn't the dead, numb kind. It was the good kind, the earned kind. He packed his lunch pail, his movements a little more deliberate, a little less rushed. As he walked out the door, the morning air felt sharper, the sun a little brighter. He hadn't changed the world, not yet, but he had changed something inside himself. He had faced a small piece of discomfort, embraced the grind, and come out the other side. And for the first time in a very long time, Hank felt like he wasn't just surviving, he was starting. That sense of earned exhaustion lasted through his shift, a quiet hum beneath the usual din of the factory floor. He even caught himself looking at a tricky conveyor belt motor, one the younger guys usually steered clear of, and felt a flicker of something new. Not dread, not annoyance, but curiosity, a tiny spark. He didn't touch it that day, but he noticed it. Then came day 3. The newness had faded, replaced by the persistent ache in his lower back from hunching under the sink and the familiar drag of another Monday. The comfortable routine, the one he'd always leaned on, beckoned him back. Skip the home repairs, just make it through the shift, then collapse on the couch. It was a powerful whisper, the siren song of least resistance. But when Mr. Henderson, the line supervisor with a perpetually stained shirt, walked past his station, grumbling about the old C-press acting up again, Hank heard himself speak. "I could take a look at it, Hendo." Henderson stopped, a grease monkey wrench hanging loosely in his hand. "You, Hank, thought you preferred the easy stuff." It wasn't a jab, just an observation. Hank usually did. A familiar heat rose in Hank's chest, a mix of embarrassment and the old aversion. It'd be easier to just say never mind. But the thought of Sarah, of the looming stack of medical bills, was a cold splash of water. He wouldn't retreat. Not anymore. Something new might be good, Hank mumbled, already walking towards the clanking, wheezing behemoth. The C-press was a relic prone to jamming, its gears grinding out a mournful tune. It had a knack for stripping threads and shearing off bolts, turning simple repairs into frustrating, time-consuming ordeals. Hank spent the next 2 hours wrestling with it. His fingers, already stiff from years of repetitive work, fumbled with unfamiliar fittings. He pulled the wrong lever once, sending a shower of metal shavings raining down, earning him a stern glance from Henderson and a few snickers from younger workers who'd paused to watch the newbie at work. His face burned. Every instinct screamed at him to give up, to say it was too far gone, to let the maintenance crew handle it later. To go back to his simple, predictable, safe tasks, his old self would have. His old self would have found an excuse, shrugged, and walked away. But this time, each stripped screw, each greasy slip of the wrench wasn't a reason to quit. It was a challenge, an opponent. He pushed through the shame, pushed through the rising anger, and focused on the problem. He bled a little, a small cut on his thumb, but he barely noticed it. It wasn't just fixing a machine. He was fixing something inside himself, one stubborn bolt at a time. By the time he finally got the C-press to hum a steady, rhythmic tune, his shift was almost over and he was drenched in sweat and grease. He hadn't felt this exhausted since he was 19 and spent a summer framing houses. When he clocked out, the weariness was bone-deep, but beneath it, there was that quiet satisfaction again. A different kind of tired. Sarah noticed it that night. He was quieter than usual at dinner, but not with the old, distant quietness. This was a tired that came with a story. "Long day, Hank?" she asked gently, tracing a pattern on the tablecloth. He nodded, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips. C-press was acting up, got it sorted. She just nodded back, a knowing look in her eyes. She didn't need details. She just needed to see him trying. Day 7 arrived with a vengeance. Hank had decided to tackle the rotten fascia board on the north side of the house. It was a job he'd put off for years, always finding something more urgent or less physically demanding to do instead. He bought the wood, borrowed a ladder from old man Miller next door, and started bright and early Saturday morning. It was a disaster. The old wood was more rotted than he thought, crumbling to dust at his touch. When he tried to pry it off, the ladder slipped, sending him sprawling into a rose bush. Thorns pricked his skin, a sharp pain shot through his elbow, and the replacement board he'd bought splintered when it hit the ground. He lay there, tangled in rose thorns, a throbbing elbow and a broken piece of lumber, and felt a wave of complete and utter failure wash over him. "This is it," he muttered, his voice raw with frustration. "This is why I don't do this kind of thing. I'm no good at it." Just like everything else. The old voices, the familiar whispers of inadequacy, swarmed him. Go back. It was safer before, less pain, less disappointment. He limped inside, the thorns still clinging to his shirt, a dark cloud settling over him. He cleaned the cuts, the sting a reminder of his incompetence. Sarah found him later, slumped at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. The broken board lay in the yard like a monument to his failed ambition. "What happened?" she asked softly, her hand on his shoulder. He just shook his head, a knot in his throat. "I can't do it, Sarah. I'm just not cut out for this. I always mess it up. I should just leave things the way they are." The despair was real heavy. The old habit of retreating, of accepting his lot, was a powerful current, threatening to pull him back under. He felt the familiar urge to just give up, to settle back into the stagnant comfort of his routine, even if it meant continued financial vulnerability. He spent the rest of Saturday in a fog, barely speaking. He felt like he was back in that kitchen, 3 a.m., staring at the medical bill, but this time he was staring at a different kind of failure. He was failing himself. He was failing them. He woke up Sunday morning, the sun already high, the house quiet. His elbow ached. Thought of facing that broken board, that symbol of his failure, made his stomach clench. He thought about going back to bed, pulling the covers over his head and pretending the world didn't exist. That was the old Hank. That was the safe Hank. But then an image flashed in his mind. Sarah's tired, worried face, the number on that hospital bill, the way Michael had been looking for a cheap used car, not wanting to burden them, Emily's quiet dream of a new laptop for school. The weight of those things, the cost of his comfortable avoidance, was suddenly heavier than any failure, any discomfort. He slowly got out of bed. He looked at his hands, calloused and strong, but for too long only used for what was easy, what was expected. He walked to the window, staring out at the splintered board, the rose bush, the ladder still leaning against the house. This wasn't a wall to avoid. This was a weight. This was fuel. He went outside. He didn't try to fix the board again right away. First, he slowly, carefully untangled the remaining thorns from the rose bush, pulling them out with deliberate care. Then he picked up the broken board, examining the splintered edge. He didn't just walk away from the failure, he walked through it. He assessed the damage, thought about why it had happened. Not because he was incompetent, but because he hadn't thought it through, hadn't prepared, hadn't learned. He grabbed a different pry bar, a sturdier one, and went back to the fascia. He worked slowly, methodically, learning with each cautious movement. When he finally got the old, rotten wood off, exposing the raw, weathered frame of the house, he felt a strange sense of accomplishment. Not because he'd succeeded, but because he hadn't quit. He'd leaned into the pain of failure, let it burn, and used it to light the way. He hadn't fixed the new board yet, but he had cleared the debris. He had understood that falling wasn't the end. It was just a chance to get up smarter. Days turned into week 2, then week 3. The fascia board project, though still unfinished, no longer felt like a looming defeat but a persistent puzzle. He picked at it in the evenings, sometimes getting frustrated, sometimes making slow, steady progress. He researched online, watched videos, asked Mr. Miller for tips, swallowing his pride with each question. He found himself seeking out other small discomforts. He started a new workout routine, simple push-ups and sit-ups in the living room, feeling the burn in muscles he hadn't truly worked in years. Each muscle ache was a reminder that he was doing something different, something hard. At the factory, he volunteered for the graveyard shift, usually shunned for its grueling hours because it meant more overtime, more money for Sarah's bills. The quiet of the factory floor in the dead of night, the hum of the machines, became his own personal forge. He often felt like quitting, felt the familiar pull of his old life, but each time he remembered the alternative, the cost of retreat. And he stayed. He pushed. He didn't just endure, he began to understand. He was using the adversity not as a wall, but as a lever. Days turned into week 2, then week 3. The fascia board project, though still unfinished, no longer felt like a looming defeat but a persistent puzzle. He picked at it in the evenings, sometimes getting frustrated, sometimes making slow, steady progress. He researched online, watched videos, asked Mr. Miller for tips, swallowing his pride with each question. He found himself seeking out other small discomforts. He started a new workout routine, simple push-ups and sit-ups in the living room, feeling the burn in muscles he hadn't truly worked in years. Each muscle ache was a reminder that he was doing something different, something hard. At the factory, he volunteered for the graveyard shift, usually shunned for its grueling hours because it meant more overtime, more money for Sarah's bills. The quiet of the factory floor in the dead of night, the hum of the machines, became his own personal forge. He often felt like quitting, felt the familiar pull of his old life, but each time he remembered the alternative, the cost of retreat. And he stayed. He pushed. He didn't just endure, he began to understand. He was using the adversity not as a wall, but as a lever. The evenings, once spent zoning out in front of the TV, now often found him in the garage, the faint glow of a work light cutting through the gloom, the scent of sawdust and fresh paint hanging in the air. One Tuesday, after weeks of trial and error, a moment of pure, quiet clarity. He finally squared the last piece of fascia, the drill humming softly as he sunk the final screw. It wasn't a cheer, not a fist pump, just a deep, satisfied breath. Sarah came out with a cup of coffee, her eyes taking in the finished work. "Looks good, Hank," she said, her voice soft, and in that simple compliment he heard a new note, a hint of admiration that had been missing for too long. He realized he hadn't just fixed a board, he'd fixed a tiny crack in their world. At the plant, the shift supervisor, a man named Dave, who usually just grunted acknowledgments, caught Hank's eye one morning. "Heard you volunteered for the new hydraulic press training, Hank. That thing's a beast." Nobody else wanted to touch it. Hank just nodded, wiping grease from his hands. "Someone's gotta learn it, Dave." It was true. The old Hank would have let someone else deal with the intimidating new machine, the complex diagrams, the potential for error. But this new feeling, this quiet fire in his belly, told him it was just another fascia board, another puzzle. He started staying late, poring over manuals, feeling foolish when he fumbled with the controls, but remembering that fall from the ladder, the burning in his hands, and how he got up smarter. He didn't transform into a loud, boisterous man overnight. Hank was still Hank, still quiet, still the kind of man who'd rather show than tell. But there was a difference. His shoulders seemed a little broader, not just from the few extra push-ups, but from the weight he was no longer carrying, the weight of unaddressed fear. The weariness in his eyes hadn't vanished, but it was now mixed with a spark, a steady, calm intensity. Sarah noticed it most. He was more present. When Emily brought home a baffling algebra problem, old Hank would have grumbled. "Ask your mother." New Hank sat down, squinted at the numbers, and even though he struggled, even got frustrated, he worked through it with her, explaining what he could, learning alongside her. Michael, home for a weekend from community college, found his dad actually listening when he talked about his classes, asking questions, offering insights from his own years of problem-solving on the factory floor. Not just nodding along, but truly engaged. He started fixing things around the house that had been broken for years, the leaky faucet, a loose step on the porch, even painting the faded trim around the windows. Each task, a small battle won, a small piece of order restored. He sought out opportunities to learn, asking questions, not just from Mr. Miller, but from anyone who knew something he didn't. He read books, actual books, about mechanics and carpentry, things he'd once dismissed as not for him. He remembered a day, months ago now, staring at that medical bill for Sarah, feeling the walls close in. He remembered the cold sweat, the despair. and he knew deep in his bones that that desperate fear was the fuel he'd needed. It had burned away the comfortable rot of inaction, cleared the ground for something new to grow. He wasn't a rich man now, not by a long shot, but the financial tightrope no longer felt like a terrifying plunge into the abyss. It felt like a challenge, a path to navigate with earned skill and resilience. The emergency fund had slowly started to grow, not just from overtime, but from his new efficiency, his willingness to take on extra, harder work. One evening, sitting on the porch swing with Sarah as the sun dipped below the trees, the air cool and calm, he spoke, his voice low, reflective. Used to be, he began, looking out at the yard he'd put so much effort into. If something got tough, I'd find a way around it or just make do with less. Figured that was being smart. A man's gotta be practical, right? Avoid trouble. But all it did was keep me small. Like I was living in a cage I built for myself just to keep the outside monsters out. But it kept me in too. He paused, a faint smile on his lips. Turns out those monsters, that hard stuff, ain't there to break you. It's there to make you stronger if you lean into it. If you face it head on. Like a blacksmith, you gotta put the metal in the fire, beat it on the anvil. It's gonna hurt, gonna scream. But that's how it gets tempered. Pain's just fuel if you learn how to burn it. Not just endure it, but use it. To light your way, to heat the forge, to keep moving forward. It ain't about being comfortable. It's about being capable. He took Sarah's hand, his grip firm and steady. And the world, he said, it's a lot bigger, a lot more interesting once you stop running from the edges. And that's the thing about life, ain't it? You can spend it trying to dodge every punch, or you can learn